Hello, folks. My name is Dan Donovan. I'm here with my friend and colleague Mario Zelaya, and we're here to talk to you today about immigration. And contextually, just before we get into the discussion, I'd like to tell all the viewers how Mario and I met. I'm the publisher and managing editor of Ottawa Life magazine right here in downtown Ottawa, in the nation's capital. We've been covering Ottawa from the federal perspective, certainly for 27 years. And we follow, obviously, information points and influence points throughout the society. And a couple of months ago, I started following Mario on TikTok because I thought, oh my God, who's this guy? This guy is really saying some really cogent things, some really important things about the state of our society today. And the more I listened to his observations, the more I thought, I've got to reach out and chat with him. And so we've done that in the last month or so and gotten to know each other a bit and talked about a number of issues. And I just thought, this from a pan-Canadian model, this gentleman's talking about a lot of the things that I sense that a lot of Canadians are concerned about, and they're not getting from mainstream media. Now, our topic today is going to be about immigration under the sort of subtext of it's not racist to talk about immigration. It's the type of thing that when it's triggering for some people. Mm-hmm. But I think contextually, before we get into it here, Mario, I just want to sort of set the scene a bit for our listeners who just understand a little bit about our immigration system. And it's under the guise that, the Trudeau government, the Justin Trudeau Liberal government has, I think it's a shared opinion by both Mario and I, has completely obliterated what was a very respected immigration system. We had the best immigration system, you could argue, around the world, from any country in the world. There are millions of people from around the world that want to come to Canada every year. And we had set up an immigration system going back like 5-6 decades, to the 60s, 70s, that was based on the points system. And the points-based immigration system basically evaluated applicants based on certain criteria, such as age, education, work experience, language proficiency, adaptability. And it was a merit-based approach. So people, it doesn't matter where you come from any country, any continent. But the idea was if you want to come to Canada, we had, and it's the right of each government, each country, to determine what their immigration policy is. And they get to choose. You get to choose. We get to choose who comes here. That's the way it is. Any country has that right. And we're all immigrants. My great-great-grandfather came from Ireland. Mario's an immigrant himself, his family. Okay, so we have nothing against immigrants. But it was a merit-based approach. And the idea was that immigrants had to have skills and qualifications that when they come here could contribute to Canadian society, to the economy, to the fabric of the society. And the word there is contribute. So we would assess applicants under this point system for decades. That worked really well. Now, it's not to say it was perfect and there weren't problems, but we assess people based on certain attributes. Mm-hmm. And what happened since, especially since COVID, just during the post-COVID years, is the Trudeau government set all of this aside. We would generally bring in 200,000 to 250,000 new immigrants a year. The Trudeau government set all this aside, and they brought in 3 million people in just over 3 years. And this is what we're going to talk about today. So, Mario, I want to start with you on this idea. This line, I think, is a perfect line. That it's not racist to talk about these things. What are your thoughts? Let's get this going.
I mean, I've always been a big proponent of it. The thing is like you're talking to someone who's an immigrant themselves. Like I came to this country actually as a refugee. Like I am considered by almost every standard a minority. Like I came here as English is my second language. And when I came here, we came here to conform to the norms. We left El Salvador for a reason. We didn't leave there for Canada to become El Salvador. And I think that this holds true for almost every immigrant that comes into the country. You're not leaving that third world to make this country that same third world that you left. And for us to say this, take it from one immigrant, to others that are maybe listening, it's not racist to say this at all. And in fact, like, my whole belief system is that facts cannot be racist. You can interpret them as that. You're more than welcome to have your opinion. You're more than welcome to interpret it however you want, but that doesn't make it true. What sorry, go ahead.
When you came here as a refugee, let me just go to that, because that's an interesting starting point.
Mm-hmm.
So when your family came here, you made the decision, you had to leave El Salvador, you came here. What was the journey like in terms of when you arrived? What was presented to you, to your family, in terms of supports and that kind of thing, and the pathway to Canadian citizenship? What did they tell you?
So I was 5 at the time. The exact core details, I would say, are what I have known from my parents. And so I'm just going to reiterate what they had told me. But basically what we did is we came through Niagara Falls, and we had a bus dropped us off at the falls. I do have this memory of it being late at night and us crossing the bridge. We crossed the bridge, hopped on a bus. Our first home in Canada was a shelter home. And this was like, you can think of it almost as like an industrial type of a warehouse. I have very, very, very faint memories of it, but I still do remember it. It's almost like what you would envision an evacuation center looking like on TV, where you have all the beds. It's just this one big open area. It's just mass beds everywhere. And it's basically what you would see kind of in the movies, right? And it wasn't when you're a kid, you don't really know the difference, and all I remember, to this day, knowing is that what was in Canada versus what was in El Salvador, so much better. And even though like this place had cockroaches, like I still remember my younger brother learning how to walk, in the game that we would play is who could kill the most cockroaches, and that's what the place was like. And so the support that we ultimately had actually came by way of a church in Oakville, Baptist church. They're right beside St. Thomas Aquinas in Oakville. And they sponsored my parents in the sense of there's a factory that's hiring, and my parents worked for a factory for, I think, over a decade until it shut down and it went out of business. But that's the support that you got. Like it's like you're coming here to work. But even before then, my dad immediately right off the hop, you're taking whatever job you can get. He was a janitor at one point in Toronto. He was washing dishes, like in Toronto. You do whatever you can. Like there's the support is you got to work, and that's.
I think to your point, if I may, like I just want to sort of follow that trajectory, because you said your folks came here and they worked, and obviously when new immigrants come in, we've got to provide some supports to help them get established.
Yep.
But what do you think has changed today? Like, I'll give you an example. I read and listen, in 2015, when the Syrian civil war was on, and it's 500,000 people that were murdered by the Assad regime. Mm-hmm. Immigrants, refugees trying to get out, come to Canada, go to Turkey, other countries. Canada was farther away, but they came here. So they come here and they get supports. I'm all for that. We got to help people. There's a certain portion of our immigrants that are going to be refugees. I'm all for supporting that. But then I read a report last week that the vast majority of those people that came here are still on social assistance.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. And that is the massive difference. And I'm going to share my screen just so people don't think, you and I are full of it or I'm making anything up. Sure. But how is it that 50% of Syrian refugees are still on social assistance 5 years after arriving?
8 years.
Like it's such a ridiculous concept. Like at that point, like there has to be a moment in time where you have to just cut off the support. And even to this point though, and I'll stop sharing my screen. But even on that point, like let's assume it's a 1 year mark. Like they know they got 1 year, and you got to get moving, just like we did. You take whatever job is available, and it's not here to be a luxury. Like my dad was a principal. My mom was an accountant. My mom was washing like literal shit off of the walls in a Holiday Inn, because that's where she worked as a cleaner. And this wasn't like it's not a 5-star hotel. She's like, the things that you see in there is absolutely grotesque. She'd come home crying because of the stuff that you'd have to do. That's what you did. That's what you have to do. You take whatever you can get when you want to come to this country and you want to, basically integrate. You take whatever job. Like, you think just because she's a doctor, an accountant, a lawyer, you can't do those jobs here. You have to. Like, you have to. And that's the thing. It's like you're not going to be waiting on social assistance for 5-10 years for the perfect job to come up that is suited to your standards. Those standards no longer exist. You left that world for a reason, and you're coming here for another. And so I think that there's this level, honestly, I think there's this level of entitlement that I've never seen before. And not only that, I think I believe the number, I saw this video that a gentleman talked about in detail. I think the total benefits that immigrants get is $82,000 a year when you combine the amount of money on average. And so if you have, Canada has a child benefit program, right? If you have a child and they're, let's say, under the age of 9 or 10, you get something like $7,000-8,000 a year. Great, fine. It's great for Canadians. Why are we giving it to people overseas? You have these families that have, 5 kids, let's say, they're getting 40 grand a year, just like that, just because they have the 5 kids. Then they get free housing. They don't have to pay for it. They're staying at a 4-star hotel. Maybe they'll be there for 6 months to a year. Once they're out of there, then they get subsidized housing, and they pay $400 or $500 a month. Then you get amounts for clothing. I've heard of people getting their Ubers being paid for so they can go to because they're gonna be giving birth. Like, whatever happened to public transport? Like, that's isn't that what the government's funding? Or what are they doing funding Uber? Like, you can take a bus. Like, the buses are there.
So there's I guess my observation on this would be, I think these are some of the points that are riling up a lot of just Canadian taxpayers who, as I said, we support immigration, Canadian taxpayers. I think there's a general healthy attitude. There was a general healthy attitude towards immigration in the country. I would postulate that in the last 2 or 3 years, that has changed. Yes. And I think because of the pressures in the society, because of the high inflation, because of the overtaxation, because of the pressures people and families are feeling, and then they're looking around them and going, well, hang on a second. They go to, for example, you go to the hospital. I mentioned to you offline an experience I had last year. I had to take my daughter to the hospital. Mm-hmm. And I've also had to take my parents who are seniors, and my parents in their late 80s. I had to take them to the hospital. And you go into the hospital, you go to emergency, and it's packed. It's packed, and in 2 occasions when I went, it's just packed with with new Canadians or new immigrants. Mm-hmm. And I don't blame them, because if they're sick, of course they should go to the hospital. Yep. But the fact is that they don't have doctors. They don't, and our health care system under the Trudeau government is also in disarray. Mm-hmm. So there's this sort of domino effect, and then you start to look around. You go, well, hang on a second. I've been paying into this system my whole life. My parents have paid into the system their whole lives. My kids are now working. They're paying into the system. And the expectation is that if we have a family emergency, we go to the hospital, I expect them in this public healthcare system to be treated. I don't expect them to wait 18 hours, and I don't expect to see a hospital emergency room full of people that have nowhere else to go because the system can't sustain it. So these are the things I think that are impacting. I think people are looking for accountability in the immigration system. So what would you say, based on what you're observing, your experience, your personal experience? I'm of the view we need some massive reforms in our immigration system. We need some massive reforms to address this issue. The Trudeau government, you made this point in one of your TikTok videos, they've taken no accountability for totally screwing up the system. So what are some of the things you observe that you think we need to do to fix this?
Well, and I think just before I start on that point, I think the average person will say healthcare is a provincial issue. You're an idiot. And people have tried making that argument with me. And sure, it is a healthcare issue that is provincial, but where they're wrong is immigration is not. And when you only have a certain amount of hospitals, and let's say I'm making this up, let's say there's 50 in Ontario, and the population grows by 30, 40, doesn't matter what the percent is, when we're already at capacity, that little push is all you need in order for us to have among the worst wait times in all of the G7 countries for, let's say, free healthcare, and maybe excluding the US because it's not free. But the issue is not only that, like, what has the Trudeau government done to do transfer payments into the provinces in order for them to build the hospitals for the issue that they created themselves by having all these immigration and asylum seekers? 70% of all claims have come in the last year. I think we had over 200,000 come in 2024. Between 2023 and 2024, I believe is the number. The number is absolutely astronomical. Of all the claims we've ever had, 70% coming in within 1 year. We're at capacity. And not only that, like, and I've spoken about this before, is in my videos, is there's so much what I call is birth tourism. And birth tourism is a massive problem because you have.
Can you explain that to people? And before you do, I just want to add one point. Just a note that I want to make, because it's a common thing, and you say it. Everybody says it. My kids say, everybody, hey, we got free healthcare here. But as we both know, we don't. We pay a lot of taxes. Yeah. We pay a ton of taxes for this healthcare system. And I've always said, you know, a public healthcare system is not an excuse for inefficiency. You know, it's not an excuse for inefficiency. I still don't know why we're paying CEOs of hospitals. They're administrators. Why we're paying them like $1.5 million a year plus and more to administrate a hospital. And we can't seem to find the money to pay the nurses the money, you know, the funds and revenues they need. We got a shortage of doctors. Why are we paying these administrators so much money? Why is it when you go to hospital, you got to pay a ton of cash to park? You know, it's like a racket. I think that's to subsidize these CEO salaries. But so it's not. It's the system is paid for by the taxpayer. So if you see people coming in who haven't paid into the system, and they're at the front of the line or they're using the system, and you go, wait a second, what the hell is going on here? How is it that these people who are not Canadian citizens, who have not put any money into the system, they come in and they can get all of these treatments, and then Canadians are struggling and suffering? So you mentioned the childbirth thing. What is that about?
So they're basically called anchor babies. Like, what? Let me ask you this: what business does a 8.5 month pregnant woman coming from, doesn't matter what country, whether it's Africa, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's from, you know, East Asia, what business do they have visiting Canada?
None.
Being that pregnant.
Zero.
For 2 weeks, right? That they're not here to look at the sites. They're not here for Niagara Falls. They're not here for the CN Tower. They're here to give birth. So what they do is they fly in. They come in on their tourist visa. They're saying they're not disclosing the fact of how, you know, basically pregnant they're coming here just to give birth. So what happens is their kid is given the citizenship because they're Canadian. They're born here. They go back to their country. And the big feedback that I've been hearing from nurses is, it's generally speaking, a lot of the kids in the NICU are from immigrants overseas that are doing the birth tourism. And these kids will have, you know, certain defects or issues when they're born. And so they're there for months at a time. Like, when you're there on a daily basis, we're talking about that. Like, we're talking about a $60,000, $70,000 bill. I've heard a story from a woman who came back to Canada like 10 years later, and they pull up their profile, and this banker basically told me, she's like, I had never seen this before, but they're like, you owe $60,000, $70,000 from like a decade ago. Like, what is that about? Oh yeah, haha, that's when I came to give birth to my child, and you know, they sent me the invoice. She's laughing about it. She left the bill. That's what they do. They have no obligation. What enforcement mechanism is there in order to make them pay for the bill? There's nothing. And so what they do is they come here, they give birth, they utilize their resource, they utilize their system, and then they take off and they go to their country. But whenever they want to come back, and let's say they're older, and let's say now they're hitting their 50s, 60s, they want to retire, cool, their kid comes here to study. They're because they're a Canadian citizen, they're entitled to. They don't have to pay the international student tuition fees, which are generally almost double. They come in, they settle in, boom, the parents come to retire, and they're sucking on our social systems. So they're getting all the benefits and providing zero value and $0 into the systems that we're the ones that are carrying carrying their backs. We're the ones that are ultimately paying their healthcare. And when you have an immigration system where you know, that there's the Century Initiative, which no one talks about, which is, I think, the craziest thing. You go on the website, it's called Century Initiative, I think, .ca. I didn't realize it was funded by, I think it was the managing director of Canada for McKinsey, and I think it's one of the heads of BlackRock. But they're the ones that basically are the big proponents, of their major liberal donors. The people who sit on their board, they're members of parliament of the liberal government. When I was looking at it, I was like, is this a government initiative? I'm like, this website, the people who are sitting on the board, I'm like, this is highly suspicious. I'm like, this is a well-funded thing. And it completely makes sense because you have two massive organizations that are pushing for growth, where they want 100 million people in Canada by 2100. And so you do the math, we're at 2025, we have what, 40 million? We're looking on average, roughly about 1 million people is what they want coming into the country. We cannot sustain that. It is not sustainable.
So you've hit a number of really interesting markers here. What are your comments about people that are come to Canada, use the services, try to get to or obtain citizenship and then leave? I recall back during the Harper years, early in the Harper years, when there was Lebanon became under, there was a conflict between Lebanon and Israel, and Beirut was under bombing, and all of a sudden, there's correct me if I'm wrong, there's around 56,000 Lebanese Canadians who said they demanded our government bring them home from Lebanon. I'm thinking, well, what the hell are 56,000 Lebanese people doing living in Beirut? If it's a problem. So you get into issues then about dual citizenship. Maybe we need to be reviewing what's the purpose of dual citizenship, and what are the constrictions and constraints that we should have around that. One of the other things too. I mean, you're a business, and Mario, a successful businessman. You've a lot of employees. One of the things that I've noticed and this is something that's totally on the Trudeau government. They've totally sort of screwed the pooch on this. This idea of hiring, you have government processes here where you're allowed as a business to hire someone who's not from Canada if it's a job apparently that Canadians can't qualify for. Well, this is what's really gone off the rails in the last 2.5 years. Is where we've allowed a number of organizations and businesses to, under the guise of there's not people here to do these jobs, bring in people to work in roles that they're not required. So it's almost like a stealth way of people coming in here and getting around the normal immigration process. What are your observations on that?
Well, what I've heard from people, and I think that whole program needs to be completely scrapped. And I think it should only apply for farming, like things that are of strategic value to the country. And generally speaking, farming has always been one of those things that every government in some way, shape, or form subsidizes. The U.S. gives their farmers direct money. We have a heavily subsidized agricultural industry. We do it by way of lower taxes, but we also do it by allowing them to have a monopoly. So every single industry has some sort of monopoly in some way, shape, or form. The dairy farmers of Canada, there's the fruits, vegetables, eggs, like you name it, that there's a monopoly, and that's how basically we are subsidizing our farmers. But other than that industry, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't see any strategic reason to have any sort of need for all these temporary people to be taking away jobs from kids who maybe are in university, who are in high school. Like, these are traditionally, there are jobs, whether in retail or fast food or anything, or any of those industries that have always traditionally been done by younger Canadians. Sure. And now they're being done by adults, and they're being done by adults that are foreigners, and they're here on a temporary basis. And I keep hearing about how people are scamming the system and how they do it. And these immigrants themselves, they're being screwed. They have to pay to get that job. So the employer, and this isn't all of them, and I'm not saying they're all guilty of it, but the way they're taking advantage of it is, you want to come into Canada, I know you can't get your citizenship and you can't get your permanent residency or anything unless you have this. This is a part of their new system, is you have to have a job, and it has to be a LMIA one. And so you pay that employee. You want that job, it's whatever, 15, 20 grand. So people pay into it, and then they get taken advantage of. And some of the horror stories that I've been hearing from it are quite astronomical. Like, it's just certain people not getting paid, being worked extra hours, working basically for free. Like, we are We
You know
created
what's interesting about that for me is I think there is both a fiduciary obligation and a legal obligation by the government to make sure that's not happening. And
Yes.
and it is happening. We know it's happening.
Yep.
And they have an obligation to go after the people that are doing that and treat them very harshly
Yes.
to cut that kind of thing out.
Yep.
And I go back to some of the scams that happen with the colleges here in Canada. All of a sudden, there are all these colleges coming out of the woodwork from nowhere, accepting under this Trudeau government program all of these foreign students, and it's a big scam.
It is.
And then even the Ford government has said it's a scam. The federal government has acknowledged it's a scam. The Indian government has just come out and said that there's a scam going on involving bringing all of these people into Canada, these Indian students into Canada, and they're really on their way to the United States. That's caused a problem with us with the Trump administration. Part of that as well is, of course, the Indian government, like Trudeau, like he's done on so many files, they've completely screwed our relationship with the Indian government.
Yep.
They're at odds. So the Indian government, picking a very tactical moment, a new president's coming in, they just piled on and said, "Oh yeah, this Indian visa thing with all these students from India coming to Canada, it's a big scam. It's corrupt." So the Trudeau government hasn't addressed that, but it just made me think of one thing. When I was younger, Mario, I went to study in France for a year. Okay, I had to get a visa. I had my student visa. When I went there, I had to prove to the French government that I can support myself as a student for a year. They're just gonna let me come in there and go to a food bank. How is it that in our country we can have these so-called students from wherever they're from? They can be from India, the Middle East. It doesn't matter. How is it? And I've seen videos of some of these students posting, if you come to Canada, you can go to a food bank for free. What?
Yep.
So I'm just thinking in terms of reforms. Like, in my view, I don't think students should be allowed to go to food banks, foreign students. I think they need to show when they come here they can sustain themselves, or they shouldn't be coming here. Those food banks are for families and people that are really struggling. Nobody wants to be at a food bank. We support food banks. So if it was up, like, just from what you've seen, I mean, from a perspective from an immigrant, you're an immigrant yourself. You're a business person yourself. You've got employees yourself. You've seen the system. You have people writing to you, telling you a lot of these incidences and stories that they're going through. We need to reform the immigration system, but what, from your sort of perspective, would you say are 3 or 4 things, like if it was tomorrow, new government, and someone said, "Hey, Mario, what are the things we need to do to try to turn this ship around to fix our immigration system?" What would you say?
Anyone who's had their visa expired, they need to be deported. And people don't want to hear that word. It's so scary. It's so mean. It's so evil. Like, how Trumpish of you. Deport.
Okay, honestly, just talk on that one for a sec, because I wanted to throw in something on there. That's interesting to me, because I've had and I consider it a privilege. I've had the privilege to travel all over the world over the last 20 years. I've, on business and other things, I've traveled extensively, and I've traveled to countries like Turkey. I've been into Syria. I've been to Kazakhstan. I've been to China. I've been to South America. I've been to Chile. And when I go to a country, when you go to Chile, you got to pay when you arrive. It's like, at the time, it was like $250, and you got to pay that to enter the country. There's a guy with a stamp, and he said, "This is the day you need to leave." When I go to Turkey, and I absolutely love Turkey. I just think it's one of my favorite countries. I love the people. Okay, but when you go to Turkey, this is when you're leaving. Okay, I can't imagine like being in Istanbul or Cappadocia or Izmir, and like if I'm there and then going and protesting outside a Turkish government building saying, you need to let me stay. You know what would happen? I'd be arrested and thrown out of the country.
Yep.
I mean, it's kind of absurd to me. So when you say deport, what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is when your visa's out, you're out.
Correct.
And if you don't leave, we're going to help you leave.
Correct.
I don't think that's an extreme position.
It's not at all. Like, to me, it's just such a logical, normal like thing, and I don't understand what is so controversial about it when people say deport, and as soon as you say that, you're labeled as a racist. And like I said, and like what you described, facts cannot be racist. You're not supposed to be here.
Your point, like, here's the problem with that narrative, because when people come here even under a system, as much as the Trudeau government has screwed it up, you've agreed on that visa that you're going to leave on that day. It's not the Canadian government or the Canadian people that are in the wrong here. It's the person. You agreed to come here and to leave. So I agree. So the first thing is, yes, you need to, when your visa's up, you got to go.
100%.
Help you go.
The other thing
tomorrow, and they're saying, Mario, okay, what are the 3 or 4 things? That's one of them. A couple others.
The next one would be, like, it is clear to me that we have this 2-tier justice system, and honestly, there is a system for us Canadians and there's a system for immigrants. And case in point, in Sudbury, there's a man who was doing he was drinking and driving. I'm looking at the article right now. He was doing more than 200 kilometers an hour, and he hurt someone in the process. There's a massive crash. Because he was at risk of being deported, the judge said to him, well, we're going to change it to a fine. And they fined him $5,000. What other country do you know of? Do you think China would do that? Would Russia do that? Would any, like, what other country? And these are the countries that are supposed to be, harsh, but even then, like, would the states do that? Have you ever heard of the United States ever being like, well, we really need people to drink and drive going 200 kilometers an hour. So instead of deporting you, even though you're here on a temporary basis, we want to keep you. And so let's make this exchange. Just pay us $5,000 and we'll call it even. And that's going to be pretty harsh. No. So
on that one, let me just go back at you now. I fully concur with that. But here's one of the challenges we're having. I look at that kind of decision and I say, who the hell was the judge that thought that would be a common and practical response to somebody who would do that? And the thing is this: if I go to another country, or if people are visiting our country and they're on a pathway to citizenship and they commit a criminal offense, now there probably would be some times maybe where you might have a look and say, well, hang on a second. But if someone has committed a serious criminal offense and they're on a pathway to immigration, my first thing is, if you're charged, you're out of here.
Yep.
And people need to be told that when they come in, because it's about respecting our government, respecting our democracy, respecting our rule of law. If you're going to put other people, Canadians and others, at risk by drinking and driving, something so irresponsible, crash your car, cause damage, you're gone.
Yes.
And I just take that a step further for me. I've expressed to you offline my concern with some of these anti-Semitic violent demonstrations I've seen in this country since October 7th. Yep. People with their faces covered, yelling from the river to the sea, fuck the Jews, kill the Jews, all of this awful stuff.
Death to Canada.
And in Canada. And I think there's this kind of perversion that's happened in the narrative. People come here and say, oh, we're free, we have the right to demonstrate, we have the right. Yes, you do. Mm-hmm. Yes, you do. But we have hate laws here. We have a criminal code. And you cannot come here and do that and say that. And my view is, and I don't think this is an extreme view, if you come here and you're in one of those demonstrations and you're not a Canadian citizen and you're expressing hateful remarks and hate speech and things that are contrary to our criminal code, and you're caught by the police doing that, you don't get to go to court. You don't get to go through the justice. You get deported immediately for doing it. Yep. But we've got this perversion. You're not a Canadian citizen. You don't have the rights of Canadian citizens here. You're breaking our laws. You're out of here. To me, that's not an extreme position.
Not at all. And I've always felt the exact same way. And I think there's a lot of Canadians out there that feel the same way. Like, I do not understand how non-Canadian citizens, people here on a temporary basis, which is, I believe, almost 10% of our population now, are temporary residents. are able to get the free healthcare. They get to have better rights than what you and I have, because this is fundamentally true, which we have clearly seen. They get better benefits. They get free money from the government. They get shelter paid for. They get free money for the kids that they have. They have put nothing, and they get to demonstrate and basically be proponents of not hate speech. And I didn't know, like, everything that you're describing. I think it was 3 months ago I learned from a military officer that they were actually breaking the law. And a military officer contacted me. He said, keep me anonymous, but these are the sections in the code that they're breaking.
The criminal code and hate speech, and
Yeah.
all of these signs and these other things they unfurled in the Eaton Center in Toronto. This is hate speech under the criminal code. And the fact of the matter is that, the police know this.
Mhm.
And it's not being adjudicated properly, and we're not enforcing the criminal code.
Mhm.
But what's interesting about this discussion is we could, and we will, I'm sure we will we'll have another discussion on immigration. There's so much to cover.
Yes.
So I'd like to propose that we have another discussion on this topic, because there's so many other things to get into, because we haven't talked about a number of things we were going to talk about. But let me sort of end my remarks by this, and I'd be interested in your response. So I think is what we're saying to the listeners this. First of all, we support immigration. We want immigration. We believe in immigration. We believe in a rules-based immigration system. We're all immigrants. We all come from all over the world. Canada's a great country that we want immigration. But we also can't be cavalier with our immigration system, as the Trudeau government has been. And, there's an old saying, people will take advantage of you if you let them.
Yep.
And because the economy is struggling now, because we're taxed to death, because Canadians are feeling the pressures of everyday life and in their healthcare system, in the grocery stores, in housing, with food, and they're looking around and facing all these challenges, and they're saying, "What? Wait a second, what the hell is this? What is going on? How can this be happening?
Mhm.
Why is this kind of treatment being afforded here?" And this is not to say, in my opinion, that we need to have a pathway, a runway for new immigrants. Heaven forbid, when your family came here, I can't imagine for your parents, that must have been such a stressful and challenging time, having young children coming into this unknown land, having to work these jobs. Ideally, we want to have a system where the pathway is as good as possible as we can make it for people. That's what we want.
Mhm.
But there's a sort of a nexus point between that and what we're seeing now in some cases. What are your final thoughts on that?
Oh, correct. I mean, the thing is that there's a sweet spot, and truthfully, a lot of the people that came in from the 80s, the 90s, their stories are going to be similar to ours. Like that they went through hell, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to go through it, because I went through it, and it's not and that's not what I'm.
I think that's not what we're going. We're trying. I mean, your experience would be, I would say, as a child who came here as an immigrant, you would want, I would think, that we want to make sure as much as we can. We don't want people going through that as much as they can. But look, there's a reality to this as well, correct?
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, look how I turned out, right? Like, and it's not like an impossibility of a scenario that you can have this, really tough path also lead to extreme success. Like it exists. Like, I'm living proof that it exists. And again, it's not to say like let's put everyone through the ringer. It's about finding a sweet spot. But is the sweet spot making sure that people are on social assistance for 8 years after 8 years of being in the country? Like that to me just seems like
that's a fail. We are failing. We are failing if we have people who come to this country and they are on social assistance past, I would say, 2 years, 3 at the very most. I mean, that's my view. At the very most.
I mean, honestly, I would even say 1.5 years would be too long. Like, I think that's too long, because like what you can do in a year, and like how like as soon as you get in, this is what you're doing. These are the jobs that are available. Like, you have to start learning English ASAP. My parents were working without knowing English. It took years. I mean, years and years and years. And we have this rule, and this is why I can understand I can understand Spanish better than I can speak it. I would speak to them in English. They would speak to me in Spanish. And so my spoken Spanish isn't as great, but it forced them to understand English much better because we learned it faster than they did at school because we're doing it every single day. They weren't. They're working, they're doing something mechanical and isolated. So they don't have that level of they don't have that social element in their work that we do at school. And so, for me, it took us, fluently probably a few years for us to learn English, but it came like this. For my parents, it was probably maybe close to a decade, maybe even then. It was probably longer than that. This stuff does take time, but these are the types of things that it's not impossible to actually work and not speak the language 100%. Like the framers that framed my house, I had to speak to them in Spanish the majority of the time because their English is so broken. I was like, okay, we'll only speak Spanish. They did an unbelievable job. I mean, an absolutely to the point where they're building another mansion somewhere else for someone else because of a video I did for them, just showing the phenomenal work that they did. Their work is impeccable. So, and this is just an example of there's so many jobs out there that, well, guess what? You don't need to know English perfectly, so you can get to work right now. So you not being able to speak English, it's not an actual excuse for you to do nothing and be on social assistance for 8 years. You're choosing that pathway because if you're telling me if you work even 4 hours a day on your English, you don't know English yet and you can't get a job, and it's been 8 years now and you're still sucking us dry, I don't think so. I don't buy that for a second.
So, there's so much more to cover here. I think those are excellent suggestions for how we have to start to recalibrate a system when there's a change in government, because I think that's going to be a requirement in this as well. I don't think we're going to get the kind of structural change and reform that we need in our immigration system. I personally think we got to get back to the point system as well. But why don't we just leave it today for there? I think we have to pick up this discussion. Mario, there's so many other things we didn't talk about on immigration.
For sure.
But I want to end the show with how we started, which is the podcast, which is and a great line you came up with for this entire podcast, which was, it's not racist to talk about these things. We have to be able to, as Canadians, all Canadians, we have to be able to discuss these things. No fear in talking about them. We're coming from a good place, but at the same time, it's that old adage: people take advantage of you if you let them, and it's up to us to make sure we develop the pathways to citizenship that work for Canadians and work for people coming here. And on that note, I think we'll end it for today, and we'll regroup soon.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks, Mario. We'll talk to you real soon.
Appreciate it. I'm gonna try pausing the recording.
Yeah, I think that was a good